Welcome to the Neomedieval Ledger. I'm Samuel Dempsey. Today, I had the honor of speaking with Shada Islam and Sven Kühn von Burgsdorff. Shada and Sven and I talked about what we are witnessing every day unfold on our phones, which is the atrocities in Gaza and the deteriorating situation in the West Bank. We talked about what is happening in Israel and Palestine, and we talked about what the European Union can do to be a global player in this, to pressure Israel, and also to bring about support and aid for the Palestinians. We talked about what has brought the EU to this point in which it is making these different recognitions, these condemnations, but overall, it's crisis of paralysis and doing anything of great effect. Sven and I also talked about the transatlantic relationship and how the EU can establish credibility at a time in which its credibility is not only deteriorating in the face of Trump, but deteriorating to its allies and to its adversaries and to its global standing due to its lack of action in Gaza. Shada Islam is one of Europe's most influential strategic thinkers on the EU's global role. She's a veteran Brussels insider. She's the founder of New Horizons Project, advising governments, EU institutions, and business leaders on geopolitics, international partnerships, and diversity in policymaking. She also writes on her Substack, Simply Shada. She previously served as the director for Europe and geopolitics at Friends of Europe, one of Brussels' leading think tanks, and this was after decades as a senior journalist and policy analyst. Her work has been featured in the Financial Times, Politico Europe, Euronews, and the BBC. Her influence has been formally recognized. In 2017, Politico named her one of the top 20 women who shaped Brussels, and in 2024, she ranked 5th in the EU Influencer Top 50 list of leading voices on EU policy. Sven Kühn von Burgsdorff was the European Union representative to the occupied Palestinian territory, based in East Jerusalem, from January 2020 until his departure in July 2023. He had various diplomatic postings as an ambassador prior to this, as he was a career diplomat that also served as a senior advisor on mediation in the European External Action Service. The conversations that I had with Shada and with Sven are extremely important. It encapsulates two various perspectives on what's happening, but both touch on the core of what is challenging Europe as a global actor. With that, here's my conversation with Shada, followed by my conversation with Sven. Shada, thank you so much for being on today. It is wonderful to have you.
It's a pleasure being here. Thank you very much, Samuel.
To kick off, I just want to give a description of the situation that we are seeing in Gaza and in Palestine right now. So we are 719 days into this war. Israel has killed at least 65,000 people and wounded over 166,000 as of today. And it's important to note, of course, that these, numbers are only as accurate as possible, as many are not able to get on the ground and actually, verify for themselves. But the Israelis' own military data indicates that civilian death rate is 83% in Gaza. And the New York Times wrote the headlines today that, quote, Europe talks big on Gaza, but struggles to act. And, the EU has spent much of these, last 718 days writing condemnation after condemnation, but really has done nothing in effect to pressure Israel or provide actual support for Palestinians on the ground. So how do you explain the EU's response over this, last 719 days of this conflict?
Well, first of all, I think that New York Times headline is wrong. We don't even talk big on Gaza. I mean, I don't know where they got that from. Yes, there are these sort of, routine denunciations and talk about a humanitarian crisis and all the rest of it. But apart from a few EU member states, Spain, Ireland, Slovenia, Belgium on a good day, I haven't actually seen an EU policymaker, an EU leader really, really strongly condemn what Israel is doing, its genocidal assault on Gaza now for almost 2 years. And of course, the ethnic cleansing that's going on in the West Bank as well, So I haven't heard those strong denunciations. They may sound strong to American ears, but here in Europe, we've seen how actively and proactively the EU can be a power for good when it comes to sanctioning Russia and its offensive in Ukraine. So we've seen a strong Europe when it comes to, talking to China about the Uyghurs, about the South China Sea or Taiwan. I mean, those are strong words that the EU can use and should use and must use. On Israel and its attack, its devastation of Gaza, not so much. And you ask me why? Well, there is obviously historical guilt, and that is understandable. There are deep economic ties, which are less well known, but the Israeli and European economies of many, many European countries are very closely entangled with each other. Very strong cooperation ties in science, from pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, defense, security, where massive arms exporters. And there's also divisions. This has always been not as sensitive as it is now, and we can talk about that, why that's the case. But I've been following this for now almost 4 decades, and it's always been a touchy subject because of the historical guilt vis-a-vis Israel and the Jewish population of Europe. But today, these divisions are very fierce and very sort of rigid, if you like. So you've got, as I said, Spain, Ireland, Slovenia, and countries like France and Belgium as well. But then you've got the stalwart supporters of Israel who are stronger now, I think, in their support of Israel than ever before. And it's strange because it's a very right-wing government in Israel, as we know. But you've got Germany, Austria, the Czech Republic, Hungary, of course, as well. So these divisions also, of course, make it very difficult for the EU collectively to take action. And I would say there's something that I, as an expert or a scholar, if you like, issues to do with Black Lives Matter and racism. For me, this is also one concern that is really out there for me, is that it's also based on racialized attitudes in the EU, sort of the colonial legacy that many of us have. What Edward Said, the Palestinian American scholar, has called Orientalism, us and them. We are the good white people, the civilized, and then there are barbarians at our gates, that kind of very simplistic binary. And I think there's that there as well, because if you see how racialized Europeans face discrimination and racism inside Europe, that is, for me, mirrored a little bit in how the Europeans empower the white, if you like, the bureaucracies, which are largely white, view Palestinians. They're seen as brown people. They're seen as the colonized. So there's that element in it as well. And that, for me, is very upsetting. But I think it cannot be ignored or discounted, Samuel.
And so the through line that you draw to of these countries that are, within the EU that are opposed to this is a post-colonial history and a racial product of this. I mean, it's interesting. I wonder, do you see there being a similarity in, maybe how certain countries have dealt with migration, let's say, and then how they observe in their domestic politics this, and then how it ends up being kind of exported out in their foreign policy, or what is kind of, because it is an interesting grouping of countries that are either resistant to address what's going on or just kind of slow to come to terms with the reality of it.
I think the one thing that is different today from, say, the 90s or the 90s, when there was a real feeling that the EU, or the European Economic Community, as it was called then, was seen as a pro-Palestinian entity, because there was a lot of sympathy within this European Union for the Palestinian cause in terms of freedom, liberation, and an end to occupation. That was a different Europe. Europe today has a very strong influence of the far right. Many of our governments are either off the far right or depend on the far right to govern, to rule. You see this here in Brussels, in the European Parliament as well. Yes, the center is holding, but the conservative right-wing parties are working quite closely with the far-right parties on issues to do with foreign policy, with migration, you mentioned it, but also on the green agenda. So you see this coming together of forces which are, I think, joined by a kind of Islamophobic sentiment, which is growing across the European Union, which, as we've seen, is being stoked by the United States and by the current government in the United States. So it's a very kind of toxic mix, a toxic brew, if you like. And of course, it does have to do with how countries are dealing with migration. And you've seen now we're talking about deportations. We call them return hubs. So the migration debate has been progressively, over the last 6 years, I would say, 7 years, been moving to the right. And our mainstream politicians are sort of embracing, adopting the rhetoric of the far right, whether it's, Keith Starmer in the United Kingdom, or whether it's our European Commission officials who are actually espousing, and I would say amplifying, some of the toxic rhetoric and the fear-mongering that's coming from far-right parties. So yes, all of this, Palestine, Gaza, West Bank, come into all of this equation, unfortunately.
And moving back to the grouping of countries that are more supportive of this. I'll just point to the most recent events. On Monday night in New York, the European Council President Antonio Costa announced that the majority of EU member states now officially recognize the state of Palestine. This is 16 member states. I think that's a super simplistic description of what those 16 states are doing. These These states include states like Belgium, in which you and I are both in. And, Belgium's recognition isn't really a real recognition. It has a lot of conditions that are unrealistic, like the return of hostages, the complete removal of Hamas, things that are, not going to happen anytime soon, and things that, I, as an American, I've seen from the lessons of the war on terror is that you can't remove an ideology. You can't just fight that away. So it's not really a recognition. That if it will happen, it'll happen much too late. And, Israeli Defense Minister Bezalel Smotrich said last month that whoever in the world is trying to recognize Palestinian state today will receive our answers on the ground, not with documents or with decisions or statements, but with facts of houses, facts of neighborhoods. So yes, we have this grouping of European states that, are taking, quote, greater action. But in recognizing the Palestinian state, I mean, with these specific conditions, Israel is basically laughing it off. So how do you assess the value of recognizing the state of Palestine and actually the actions that these groupings of states are taking right now?
Samuel, I don't think Israel is laughing it off. I think Israel is very worried because this is a major shift. Okay, it's symbolic. It's more in words and then in action. It doesn't really mean anything when a genocide is actually going on and, Gaza is being reduced to a rubble. What are we going to recognize? What state, what people, what kind of boundaries? Will there be boundaries? Can, Gaza survive this 2-year-long genocidal offensive, the starvation, etc.? Yes, you're right. It's symbolic. But my feeling is that Israel is really concerned because for the first time, countries like, first time in this recent period, you've got, 16 countries out of the EU that have shown their anger, I would say. They've shown their feelings, their disapproval, the fact that they're not backing Israel, not falling into the trap of being called anti-Semitic and then worrying about that. I think that slur, anti-Semitism, if you criticize Israel, I think that lost its bite. Actually doesn't mean anything anymore because many of the Jewish scholars and friends of mine actually are saying, criticizing Israel is not being anti-Semitic. Many of them do as well. So that slur, that insult has lost its meanings. So I think Israel is really quite worried about how the European Union is shifting. Slowly, painfully slowly, I would say, for people like myself, but it is happening. And though it's symbolic, it does show that things are changing. Geopolitically, these countries are important countries. I mean, we still have, the European Union still has clout as a trade power, economic power. So of course, it's very little when it comes with conditions, and we're all talking about, something that will happen one day, I hope. But it lays the groundwork for a two-state solution, whatever that is. So I think diplomatically and symbolically, this is quite significant. It's too little, too late, and too many conditions. But in geopolitics in today's world, little steps matter. And this has been done very publicly by someone like Emmanuel Macron, the president of France. So, it carries weight. It does.
Yeah, I can, I believe that it carries weight, but I think there has to be a mechanism behind it that actually can lead to some sort of real world, kind of barometer of punishment for Israel in some regard, to actually feel the consequence of what it's doing. And, you talk about the clout of the economic relationship that the EU has as a bloc with Israel. I mean, just to talk about the association agreement, which for listeners, this is the treaty that basically provides the framework for EU-Israel relations and allows for a free trade area for most goods. And it has made the EU the largest trading partner of Israel and the largest source of foreign direct investment. And so this is, to me, this is a really big, mechanism that could be used, but the issue is there is not able to, reach enough of member state approval for actually using this to inflict sort of kind of pressure on Israel. And as a result, then Kaya Kallas says, the EU foreign policy chief has called for member states to take action in their own hands and, increase tariffs, have sanctions against Hamas leaders or a select few of Israeli leadership. And, so how do we actually have tools that back this big symbolic shift that we're seeing?
So absolutely right, Samuel. I mean, this recognition of the Palestinian state is a symbolic move. It's a geopolitically important move. But the real thing is let's stop this genocide. Let's stop the killing, the targeted killing of children, women, doctors, nurses, journalists like you and me, just going around doing their job. And so that is the major priority for the moment. And that's what the flotilla is about. That's why, there's an aid blockade there. So there's so
Mm.
many areas where so many tools that we could be using as a European Union. Absolutely so. And as you said, the trade partnership is enormous. Our business interests are enormous. And if we were to arrive at a qualified majority, if Germany and Italy were to acquiesce and agree to these removal of certain preferential tariffs on Israeli imports or exports into the EU, that's millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars of duties that will fall on Israeli exporters. That would be an important move. If we were to stop the scientific cooperation or partnership of Israel in the Horizon Europe project, that would be important in terms of also what their companies would no longer be able to work. If we did have stronger procurement rules and countries and arms exporters were not allowed to take part in that, these things would be important. If we were to make sure that food aid actually got in rather than be gullible and fall into the trap of, yes, we'll have this humanitarian foundation do that. So, and if we did have sanctions, financial sanctions or sanctions on extremists from the West Bank, these things would matter. But we're not doing any of that. We've made these proposals, half-hearted, half measures, 2 years into the genocide. And imagine if we'd done this before. I mean, we could have prevented so many deaths. Now, of course, it's going to be very difficult for Germany and Italy to change stance. And, the countries that are blocking may still block. So we're really, Samuel, the truth, we're complicit in this genocide. We are part of it. We're not enforcing the International Criminal Court's orders on, suspending visas and other contacts. And we're not doing what the ICJ or now just recently the UN Committee on Inquiry into the Palestinian territories has said we should act to stop. It is our duty to act to stop the genocide. So we're not. We're really in violation of international treaties and, frankly, on the Israel agreement that you've mentioned, on our domestic treaty, because we're supposed to suspend the agreement, right, if there are human rights violations. We're not doing that.
And so to be clear, the issue is not that Europe doesn't have the tools or the mechanisms to actually affect change on this. It's a lack of will to do so.
Absolutely. Lack of will, and now that we're proposing these measures, we're doing it. Yeah, I think, it's right. We should be suggesting that we could have done that 2 years earlier. In the first weeks of its offensive after the Hamas attack, the terrible Hamas attack, Israel was already violating certain international treaties and was guilty of abuse of human rights because it was targeting civilians. So lack of will, absolutely. Yes, complicity because of lack of will.
And do you have hope that with this big symbolic shift that we've really seen kind of come to a fold this week, do you have hope that this will develop, or do you see this as kind of being the track that we're on and the status quo will be what is kind of maintained?
The thing is, Samuel, I've been saying, I have to say, I said this, I think 2 weeks into the genocide in November 2023 already. The states collectively are stuck because of our rules, our qualified majority rules, and because of the need for consensus on some measures. So the only way forward is to act unilaterally. Perhaps in coalitions, several countries getting together, coordinating and working out, but it cannot be done collectively. That is the tragedy of Europe today. When it comes to the Middle East, when it comes to Gaza, especially in Israel, we are stuck because of our lack of political will, but also because of the instruments, if you like, the toolbox doesn't allow for majority voting in many very, very important issues. So if we are to salvage Europe's reputation, the allegations and the accusations, correct ones, about double standards, the only way forward, and also to respond to our own people. Europeans are angry, Samuel. Yes. Europeans are out on the street. You saw what happened in Italy just a few days ago, the national strike. So the disconnect between European leaders and European citizens is growing wider as well. And the only way someone like Sanchez will respond to his Spanish public is through national measures. He cannot rely on the EU anymore. The EU collectively is stuck in a very bad place geopolitically.
And so we've seen that actually with Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez. He just banned or did a permanent ban on the sale of weapons and ammunition to Israel. And this is a big move for Spain, and this will make a small difference, but it won't obviously be the deciding factor. Talking about these unilateral actions that have to happen and the coalitions maybe that could happen within that. I mean, the real arms provider to Israel, as we know, of course, is the United States. And so something that, has been on my mind is, and actually just to provide context first on that, I mean, the US right now is planning to sell $6 billion of new arms to Israel. And throughout the duration of the relationship from 1946 to 2024, Israel has received $228 billion in military aid from the United States, which is, the largest recipient in history. And so why don't we see unilaterally or a coalition of European states actually having discussions with the United States, leveraging the trade relationship, which also it has as a bloc? The EU is the largest trading partner of the United States in over $1 trillion relationship. So why is that not something we're seeing where they actually, put pressure and want to force at the core of the issue some resolve with the United States to say, hey, let's not send these arms that are being used to, carry out a genocide?
Samuel, after yesterday's sort of declaration that Donald Trump made at the UN General Assembly when he criticized the European Union for its migration policies, for its green agenda, the tariffs that we face, under this administration. I mean, all of this has, as you've seen, absolutely destabilized and overwhelmed the European Union collectively. I mean, we're struggling to find our bearings, really, faced with an ally that suddenly has turned into an adversary, So our whole system, our belief in this alliance, in this transatlantic partnership, and to be very frank, our junior status when it comes to dealing with America. We've always been the junior partner. We've never been able to actually convince the Americans to do something if they didn't want to do it. It's a question of how you actually deal with the main partner. The United States is responsible for Europe's security. We're seeing this now with the struggle over Russia and Ukraine. Who has the final word? Europe is missing when it comes to these peace talks or whatever they are between Russia, Ukraine, America, maybe China could be in. We're not there when we're talking about Gaza. We're not there when we're talking about the global South. We're sort of at the moment, because of our own temerity, if you like, and our status as, I'd say, kindly junior partner, some would say vassals of the United States, we are not in a position, given our own sort of fragilities, to talk about Gaza and Israel to the United States. I think Donald Trump will just send us off without listening. But having said that, I think this recognition of the Palestinian state, whatever this means, and you and I agree that it doesn't mean too much at the moment, I think that is a sign that, because Trump doesn't like it, he's furious at it, like what the Europeans have done, unilaterally, nationally. So that's, in a sense, that's where we're showing a little speck of independence, a little speck of self-respect, and, some autonomy in our foreign policy.
Yeah, I think junior partner is an interesting phrasing because I understand that. And obviously in practice for much of the history of the EU as a global actor, that has been the case. But, when I think of junior partner as an American, I often think of Canada. And Canada is a country that has far less economic weight than the EU as a bloc, and kind of really overall, I mean, sure, there's a lot of goods, of course, that pass between, back and forth between the US and Canada, but overall, substantially, it's not on the same scale. And yet we've seen Mark Carney be able to show a little more teeth in dealing with Trump. And so I do think that while being a junior partner indeed is the case of the EU or a lot of what could be other coalitions of European states, I think there is some more punch that could be kind of put there. But anyways, I want to also talk about the genocide question, of course. Teresa Ribera, the European Commission Executive Vice President, she has said very clearly that there is a genocide in Gaza. And she has also talked about how Europe is too divided to do anything about it. And last month, the leading genocide scholars have passed a resolution stating that Israel's actions meet all the legal definitions of genocide. And for those listening, the definitions of that are that, you have to have the commitment and intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And these genocidal acts can include killing, causing serious bodily harm, mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction in whole or in part. And I think that's kind of the key part, in whole or in part. And focused on that, I mean, Netanyahu said earlier this month that, while he was signing the E1 settlement, which is the West Bank settlement that will prevent a contiguous Palestinian state, said that, quote, "We are going to fulfill our promise that there will be no Palestinian state. This place belongs to us." So with all of that said, you kind of already said this already, but do you see this as a genocide? Why is it hard for some to see this as a genocide? And is Ribera's statements reflective of, a majority sentiment coming from the EU? And, really, if not, I mean, why is it the case when the majority of scholars are saying this is what's happening, and we have Netanyahu himself saying that this place belongs to us, there is no Palestinian state?
It's a very interesting question. First of all, I don't think that the majority of EU member states have the self-confidence. It is really a question of self-confidence, of looking at this and saying blatantly what it is. As you said, the UN committee has said it, the scholars have said it, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch. I mean, and you and I can see what's happening. It's being live streamed. The genocide is being live streamed. So we know what is happening. And I think there's no denying it. But I think there's this blind spot, if you like, which is, sort of being eroded slowly because the horrors that are coming through are just so terrible. But I think a lot of for reasons of history, Samuel, but also, as I said, for reasons of racism, let's call it that, this feeling that, Israel, and that's a game that Netanyahu has played, that, they're the civilizational kind of outpost of the West in this barbaric Middle East. It's the democracy. All of those narratives have been with us for so long. They have become part of how Western world sees Israel, this plucky little democratic state stuck in a region which is, full of nasty Muslim barbarians and terrorists, all the racialized and rather toxic, eliminate all the brutes kind of narrative that is in part of our psyche, really. I think that comes into play. And then, as I said, for countries like Germany, I think using that word will it's terrifying for them to do that because it means really cutting off and part of the never again narrative. It will become very difficult for them. So I understand, but I also think that in today's world, when there is this thing, a genocide going on, Samuel, we have to move beyond these fragilities and weaknesses. And for the sake of humanity, when a crime of crimes is being committed by a state which is an ally of the European Union, we have to call it out. We have to stop the genocide. Otherwise, we lose not just moral ground, but we lose the world. I mean, you cannot talk about climate change and sustainable development goals and, the green agenda and digital progress when you allow a genocide to take place while you are alive yourself watching this. It's a terrifying thing. It's a moral problem for me, but more than that, the question really of who we are as human beings on this planet.
And to move on from these fragilities, I think is a leadership question. And looking at the leadership question, Ursula von der Leyen has kind of stuck to the status quo on this. She has not been where Ribera or many others actually have been within the EU. She's talked about rebuilding in Gaza after this ends. She's talked about pressuring a select few within the Israeli administration. But all in all, it hasn't been, I think, the leadership needed to kind of overcome these issues. And so how do you assess her leadership on this? And do you think she represents maybe kind of the aggregate line that forms when you have two very different extreme directions happening in Europe on this?
So I wouldn't use the word leadership at all when talking about Ursula von der Leyen or Kaja Kallas on Gaza and the West Bank and Israel. I think that word should not be used. They have shown none. It is true that Ursula von der Leyen in recent months and Kaja Kallas in recent months have tried to sort of change the narrative. This brings me to, Omar El-Akkad's book, One Day Everyone Will Have Been Against This, as it's too late. And they're doing it in mealy-mouthed ways. That's the word I would use. It's half-hearted and the half measures. The European Commission can turn around now and say, well, it's up to member states. They're not doing anything. But the European Commission is also supposed to take a leadership role when it comes to suggesting proposals, initiatives. They have done none of that. Instead, they have repeated these platitudes and, these old narratives about, as I said, the plucky little state, standing by our allies. No leadership at all. And it's been extremely shocking for all of us. They are showing leadership on Russia and Ukraine. So they're capable of it. And the fact that they're not doing it on this issue is obviously because they don't think it's worth their while. And that is, I think, one of the biggest shocks that we have in the system at the moment to a lot of people, including European citizens. I mean, people who are out in the streets know the difficulties that are there. They know that
Mm,
these things cannot be done, but they want leaderships to have a consistent moral compass. If you are engaging in some very tough action on Russia, rightly so, you should be able to
yeah.
do the same thing when Israel is committing a genocide, and you're not doing it. So there's a big gap there. And I think leadership is not something we've seen. At the moment, we're seeing it from Ireland, from Spain, from
Mm,
Slovenia, a few other, policymakers in Europe, in the European Parliament, in national governments, in,
yeah.
national politicians, but not here in Brussels. I'm afraid not at all.
And obviously, time is not on the side of Palestinians in this question. But seeing as von der Leyen, she doesn't have an eternity left of her term, there will be, a future in the EU with new leadership. And, do you think that this leadership we're seeing from Spain or Ireland can trickle upwards and be reflected at the top on the horizon? Or is it still too big of a challenge to overcome with countries like Italy and Germany?
I have seen leadership from the European Commission in the past. I have seen leadership on issues that are difficult, complex, and challenging, including on Palestine. It does exist. So there is a possibility that someone else, a new leadership that comes in, more moral, more in tune with issues to do with modern day, occupation, colonization, more aware of the big stakes, more aware of our societies, how our young people are thinking, and are less set in their ways and less attached to old narratives. I think if there is a change in leadership in that thing, yes, I think the European Commission has a major role to play, and I really hope that the European Union, Samuel, can find its moral compass, because we need in this world that Donald Trump has turned into really might is right. And it's unpredictable, it's volatile, and democracy is being backsliding everywhere. The far right is on the rise everywhere. In this world, you do need not a global policeman, but a kind of a beacon, something that gives you a hope that there is more
Yes.
to life and more to this world than just power struggles and zero sum games. The European Union used to stand for that, and it doesn't make you, as people think, if you're a soft, you're weak. And I think a soft power actually means having a lot of strength in today's world. But we're now
Yes.
we've been captured by this narrative of security and defense. Very necessary to have security and defense, but it shouldn't
Mm,
mean without a reference to human rights and human dignity. Cannot just have might is right policies. And I think that's where the European Union now is struggling to find its feet. It's being
mm,
dragged in two very opposite directions. And you need to find middle ground. And the European Commission can provide that, but unfortunately at the moment it is not. Finally, I'd say, Samuel, what's our reaction, how the European Union is reacting or responding to what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank. I think it really is a moral test of our time. It's a moment of moral reckoning for the European Union. It's a moment where we have to decide and make up our minds about what kind of power we are or we're going to be. Is it going to be just about security, but will we bring in human security as well? Will we have a morality even as we pump up our defenses and our security, which we should be doing? This is a moment that is changing the world. It's not just a Middle East war, it's genocide. And it is the future of humanity. And the European Union needs to be on the right side of history. For the moment, some of its countries are, but collectively the EU has shown itself to have feet of clay. And that is very sad.
Well, Shada, thank you so much for being on, and thank you for being a clear voice and having directness in your advocacy on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sven, welcome to the show, and it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much, Samuel.
So during your time as the EU ambassador to Palestine from January 2020 to July 2023, where you were placed in East Jerusalem, what was your experience like, firstly? And second to that, did you foresee the situation boiling over as it has now? Because you were, I'd say one of the quickest people after October 7th to kind of sound the alarms about what was unfolding and going to unfold for Palestinians.
Yeah, what was it like? I'm a German national. I was born, I think, in the same year as Ursula von der Leyen. So we were both groomed very much as pro-Israel because of the collective guilt the German nation assumed after the terrible Holocaust. And so, I came to this posting. It was the last posting of my career. I was a 2 times ambassador before in South Sudan and Mozambique, and I was also the chargé d'affaires opening the EU delegation in Havana, where I oversaw the demise of Fidel Castro until 2007. So it was an interesting end of my career. I was not a Middle East specialist at the time. I was asked to represent the European Union in the occupied Palestinian territory. So on the first day I came, I literally honestly started seeing the injustice unfolding before my eyes. It was easy to see that simply regarding the checkpoints and seeing the, so to speak, apartheid wall separating the occupied West Bank from Israel proper. And of course, over time, when I started visiting Palestinian families and saw them being evicted from their homes or their property destroyed, their houses demolished, I saw egregious human rights violations when the Israeli army or security forces used disproportionate lethal force, often against children. So when I saw all this, of course, my narrative shifted, and I became very quickly engaged in trying to not only express sympathy and empathy for the Palestinian people, but also trying to use my diplomatic assignment in a way which I think was fully compliant with my mission statement, meaning representing the EU based on the premise of international law and human rights, right? And then that is the very sort of foundation upon which not only the EU is built upon, but also upon which we actually have built our Middle East policy. So I became publicly engaged in, visiting these sites of, if I may say so, IDF aggressions against the Palestinian population under their responsibility and under the Geneva Convention. It's up to the occupying power to ensure the welfare, economic and social welfare of the population under their control. When I saw this was not happening, I tried to do my very best together with my colleagues in the EU delegation. I had 80 altogether, for 50% of whom were Palestinians, and of course our headquarters, to do my very best to address this, both politically, diplomatically, but also development cooperation means. Came to an end at the end of July 2023, and in my departure, so to speak, farewell, literally speaking, speech on the 9th of May 2023, actually it's online if you want to see it, I actually was alerting to the possibility that unless the root causes of the Palestinian predicament and the fact that they cannot enjoy their right to political self-determination, unless this is addressed, I would not be surprised, and to the deepest disappointment of myself, surprised if this were to boil over. You cannot keep, a lid on a boiling pot of water, which at one point in time cannot sustain the pressure building up. And Gaza was case in point. I very much hoped that this would not happen. And when actually the 7th October happened, I did, of course, not expect this terrible outbreak of violence, the terrible massacre Islamist militias then did, especially to Israeli civilians. Innocent civilians, but readers and people listening to us should also know that of the 1,200 Israeli citizens killed on that morning, in these morning hours, 381 were actually IDF soldiers and security personnel, because what Hamas did, once they breached through the wall separating Gaza from Israel proper, they actually attacked 50 military posts first. And took then many soldiers whom they did not kill. It was a terrible massacre as well, Gaza. And then they attacked the kibbutzim, and then also they attacked in parallel. It was a terrible disaster and massacre of the civilians enjoying a music festival 2 kilometers outside the perimeters of the fence, which, according to what I knew, was not actually planned, but unfolded because there was a complete breakdown of command and control of the Hamas and other militias. That, of course, was unprecedented. It was, in military terms, the biggest disaster since 1948 for the state of Israel, the biggest disaster. And it was actually committed by a few hundreds, 1,000 commandos who were actually prepared for it for years to come, or at least 1 or 2 years. And then, of course, completely went completely out of control in a way that we had these terrible victims and massacres with the civilian population. And then far too late, Israeli forces came only 6 hours late and started and then to fight back. By that time, most of the damage was done. And then, of course, the real thing started in terms of the Israel vengeance, the retribution, which is lasting until today, and also people should know this. To this day, nearly every 9th Gazan citizen has either been killed, maimed, or severely injured.
Yes.
The figures are beyond 230,000 Palestinians, and this is corroborated by United Nations statistics, meaning this is the worst humanitarian disaster and the most dreadful military campaign, certainly of the 21st century, right? And very much perpetrated by military equipment coming from the US and from Germany and some other states.
Before I address the military support factor, because I do want to get to that, when you're talking about how your narrative changed, prior to you being in East Jerusalem and then once you got there, when you communicated that narrative that you were seeing back to Brussels and you were trying to then use, your mission to better the situation, how was that received?
Well, actually I was in tune with my headquarters, right? So, I didn't do anything which was outside agreed EU policy. If you read the council conclusions, ever since we had council conclusions on the Middle East, I was doing just that. The way I was doing was probably pretty unusual because I used my assignment as the EU representative, the EU ambassador, in a very publicly engaged manner. Right? Yeah. I didn't do like behind the table talks. I said, no, we need to shift the narrative and we need to demonstrate solidarity and empathy with the Palestinians. And what I also did was I didn't do this on my own. I invited my European colleagues. We had 23 member states missions, still having them in Ramallah and East Jerusalem. Let's go together as the EU, right? And then I invited media, journalists, accredited journalists there, Palestinian and regional, Al Jazeera and, New York Times and BBC and others, and said, come with me and let's go and let's see for yourself what's happening. And then, of course, I made statements on behalf of the group I was representing as the EU representative. So that, of course, had then ramifications in terms of public outreach, in terms of public messaging. And that, of course, did not go down well in the political circles of Israel, of course, because I was seeing as being sort of overly aggressive and leading my diplomatic brief. And they were not used to that kind of behavior. I was, of course, very much supported on the Palestinian side by the PA, but also more importantly, I think, by civil society and many people in Palestine. And this was also very much true in Gaza, where I spent, at least 15 times during my 3.5 years there. So I had a mixed resonance, so to speak, and depending on the audience. But from the Palestinian side, very positive, I'd say.
And so it sounds like that from the EU side and from EU member states, you did have some interest and you had, some support in how this was going. And so kind of fast forwarding a bit, you just wrote a piece that came out yesterday for Your Active talking about the paralysis that the U.S. had on Gaza. So firstly, can you walk me through that piece and how do you explain that there was, initial interest before all of this came to a boiling point, as you describe, and support for your mission to now this paralysis that we see?
Samuel, I invite you to read actually the 3 pieces I wrote before that.
Sure. Okay.
On the 9th of May, in Politico, by the way, where I was complaining about the fact that the EU was not moving. And I wrote another one, I think, in Your Active. I think it was a month ago or something, where I also addressed the issue, but more from the aspect of if the EU can't move as a collective body, what can individual member states do?
Yes.
To overcoming this paralysis, and I will come back to in a second when I explain the paralysis. And then I felt it's not sufficient to just talk about the EU problems. I mean, why member states and the EU doesn't move, we also talk about the global south and the Gulf. There's also a bit of hypocrisy there
Yes.
because, I mean, China is maintaining a very flourishing commercial trade relationship with Israel, despite its, it's criticizing it before the UN fora, 16.3 billion every year commercial trade. India, 5 billion, Azerbaijan, 2 billion. Even the UAE, right, between October 23 to August 24, 2.8 billion. So I felt there's also some of, if I may say so, double standards. You
Yes, very
criticize
much so, yeah.
before the UN, but when it, push comes to shove, when it comes to tangible commercial measures, they shy away, right? So that was my third piece. And my fourth piece was actually now, well, fine, we have addressed the EU problem. We are talking about the global south and the double standards in partly speaking in the Arab world and the Gulf countries and the global south, certain key players, of course. And then now how about the US, which is the real specter looming over our perilous? And for me, it was like, as I said in my piece in Euractiv Now, which was published yesterday or the day before your, was the specter of Trump is looming over this power play between the Commission, spearheaded by President von der Leyen, and represented in Foreign Affairs by Madame Callas, and key member states, which right now don't move forward, and other member states which actually do. And let me explain this a little bit. I think that is where your question probably is leaning towards. So we have right now a situation where the Commission cannot move forward with a qualified majority voting procedure because of key member states, to be Germany and Italy. What is qualified majority voting? It actually means that you need a critical mass of at least 15 member states out of the 27, representing 65% of the population, to pass a measure which can be taken under community competence, which means, for instance, commercial policy, or where the foreign security and policy stipulations allow that to happen.
Yeah.
I don't want to go into legal nitty-gritty here, but also under the foreign policy provisions, you can use qualified majority voting, subject to having unanimity on applying measures under this procedure. I'll give you one example. If, for instance, one were to decide to suspend the entire Europe-Israel Association Agreement, you would need to do this under unanimity rules, but the implementation thereof could be taken by qualified majority voting, right? So then
specific measures within the agreement could be affected by it.
Exactly. Yeah. So now the Commission proposed, after they determined that there is a blatant breach of the human rights clause, which is Article 2 of the Association Agreement, they proposed in mid-July to the Foreign Affairs Council of the member states to partially suspend an element of the Horizon program, which is the flagship program of the EU, the over-allocation of which over the 6-year budgetary period until 2027 is 100 billion euros. And they proposed to suspend Israel's participation under what we call the EIC Accelerator Program. The Accelerator Program is actually fund basically a partial window of the Horizon program, whereby startups engaging in technological innovation, but also dual-use technology can benefit from co-funding from the EU and the member states. Israel has been a primary beneficiary of this allocation, and actually the allocation which would have been effective by that are 200 million euros of projects Israel has applied for. We're talking about SMEs in particular. Now, it's important because we're talking about dual use. We're talking about drone development, surveillance technologies. So it has actually impact on the ground, on the battlefield. Fine. Even for that relatively mild, modest, timid measure, right, considering what we all could have imagined, there was no qualified majority for that. And they didn't even bring it to the vote, but because they knew that Germany, Italy, in addition to, of course, Hungary and the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, and probably others were objecting to it. So, and that, of course, also led us I probably should say that I'm also part of a committee director, like a steering team, so to speak, of ex-ambassadors and senior officials. We have now nearly 400 members in this group, and we wrote 3 public letters and one important press statement on the 10th of September addressing the EU leadership to act, with resolve and determination. So in one of our letters on the 26th of August, we actually directed our attention to the member states. Say, if the EU can't move because, if you even don't approve of Madame von der Leyen's or Madame Callas, timid proposal, well, then member states have to act.
Yes.
And actually, ever since you saw that, some member states did. Spain, Slovenia, Ireland, Belgium not only recognized Palestine, but more importantly, they actually suspended arms trade with Israel. They blocked access of extremist ministers, Motorich and Ben-Gvir, to their countries. They said we are going to persecute indicted or suspected war criminals before our courts. We revisit our consular services for people who live in illegal settlements. We sanction violent settlers, all these kinds of things. And now, last but not least, very important, we also want to ban trade with illegal settlements, which is an interesting thing. We can talk about this later on. So just in a nutshell, a couple of countries of the EU move forward as a group, but outside the EU orbit. And actually, they can create coalitions of the willing with other countries in the global south and other countries in the Western world.
So I do want to get to these unilateral coalitions in the sense that can form. But firstly, looking at the paralysis, and obviously some of these member states, as you're saying, they're not willing to move on this. And, I'm trying to understand what explains that full paralysis because, in the United States, and you talk about the influence of Trump, which we'll also get to in a moment, in the United States, it's AIPAC. That's kind of the primary driver. That's the singular factor that many can attribute to the unwavering support for Israel that the United States has. But there's no AIPAC in Europe. And so to me, it seems like a lot of this member state paralysis that then, leads to EU paralysis is a bit self-imposed. And so I guess the question is, how do you view that? And secondly, when I framed this to Shada Islam, she pointed to things like, systemic racism or post-colonial perspectives that have kind of made there be an unwillingness to pursue this. And part of what kind of, can affirm that may be the case is that there is a, uncomfortableness. It's changing now, maybe, we'll see. But there's an uncomfortableness for much of Europe to engage with Trump over Ukraine. And yet we see Europeans willing to do that when there is a bit of a similar situation. So how do you weigh these factors and see the paralysis from these member states?
Yeah, I think you have to decline it by member state by member state. There is no unisono explanation for that. Let's start with Germany, the country.
Yes. If we could look actually at Germany and Italy, I think that would be the two most important.
Germany, of course, it's the collective guilt, which led to what Madame Merkel formulated before the Knesset in 2009, that Israel's security and Israel's right to existence is part of German Staatsräson, raison d'etat, the reason of being as a state. And this was completely misconstrued in the German political discourse as no matter what, right or wrong, we have to stand with and by Israel. And that actually was then pronounced publicly by so many politicians and intellectuals who still have, under the influence of the collective guilt and our obligation towards the protection of Jewish life, that this perverted, if I may say so, to the absurd scenario that Israel cannot do wrong. But then we say, critical views say, of course they can do wrong. It's about the Israeli government acting. Yeah. And and
real quick, countries like Germany have also said never again. That's also another.
And never again. But the never again doesn't mean never again these terrible crimes against Jews, never again any crime against any people because of race, ethnicity, and other qualifications which fall under all these international conventions, which after the Second World War, the international community has developed and agreed upon to avoid that never again. It's not just singular case for the Jewish people, it's for all people, Christian, Muslim, any religious domination, and any ethnic group. And that, of course, and the problem was, of course, that we had a big problem in Germany to accepting that international law precedes our Staatsräson towards the protection of Jewish life. And that is one of the problems. It's an ideological constraint we impose on ourselves, which is very German, right? It has, and most other countries don't have that. Many countries share this historical guilt, collaborators with the atrocities of the Nazi regime. in many Central European countries, but also
Very much
Italy,
so. Yeah.
but also in France, the Vichy regime and others. But we, the Germans, were the only ones assuming the responsibility. Others did not. Right? And this is understood and understandable. But it cannot be that we place Israel and the conduct of Israel's government above international law. And that's, I think, the main point of contention here. And as you can see right now in the German internal discourse, also in amongst the coalition partners, the SPD, the junior partner in the coalition, with the CDU and CSU, which is the majority partner, there is a strong crisis unfolding right now. The crisis, of course, becomes a problem for the politicians because there is this strong public opinion in Germany where now by 83% of Germans say we consider Israel's conduct in Gaza not only inappropriate but unjustified.
Yeah.
It's the highest number of that notion, I think, in any European country, right? And that is a country with a collective guilt. So there is public pressure on German politicians to change course. And that is the reason why Chancellor Merz on the 8th of August actually issued a hold to certain arms supplies to Israel, which can be used in Gaza. I mean, still, I think it's rather symbolic because it doesn't include, for instance, ongoing contracts, and it doesn't address dual-use technology and other things and equipment. But still, it's an important case, you know.
And do you think that represents a pivot in which we are seeing a change that maybe would make it possible for Germany and Italy to get behind these different mechanisms like suspending parts of the association agreement that could, actually lead to the qualified majority necessary? Because we, as you described, we have the public support that is putting pressure. And then obviously the on-the-ground situation is getting worse every single day. So what else would it take, or has it already happened that this shift has developed?
This is very difficult to say because I haven't addressed the Italian equation right now because I don't know this as well as I know happened to Germany, of course. But the Fratelli d'Italia, which is the ruling government party of Madame Meloni, of course, shares also certain affinity with populist leaders and partly, I would say, authoritarian leaders.
Yeah.
Like Mr. Netanyahu in Israel, right? So, or Mr. Trump for that matter. But you saw the big manifestations and strikes yesterday and movements in Milan, Torino, and even, workers in the Italian ports who were very actively protesting against what's happening. And you saw that Madame Meloni sent actually a naval ship to protect the Sumut flotilla, which is on its way to the Gaza coast, and so did yesterday Prime Minister Sanchez, a Spanish one, to protect them because they are European citizens and Italian and Spanish citizens on these. And the Minister of Defense in Italy recently made a very sort of outspoken speech. So the question is, what does it take to swing the pendulum in Italy and in Germany to an extent where inaction on the Israeli Netanyahu front becomes too costly for the politicians to bear? And that's exactly the question. It's about political arithmetics. As you can see, in some countries where you had fragile coalitions, politicians moved. Look at Spain. Prime Minister Sanchez became rather outspoken once he had a coalition with Sumar. And Sumar was very much pro-Palestinian. It was a very important issue for them. If you were to have, for instance, in France, in their coalition talks right now, where Les Insoumis were to assume an outside, which they won't, but if they were to assume an outside role in the new government, you would immediately have a clear change in the French position because the French president tries to navigate and oscillates between the poles. And in France, we have 1,000 Jewish French citizens, and we have 5 million Muslim citizens in France, right? So he has to take into consideration all these important groups there and constituencies. You saw in the Netherlands that the foreign minister Veldkamp and his party resigned from the government coalition over Israel and Gaza, right? You saw in Belgium that the Minister of Foreign Affairs with his party actually forced the hand of the Prime Minister Bart de Wever and say, no, we are doing much more. We're moving forward. We are not, we are recognizing Palestine and we do much more. So it's all about coalition politics in these fragile coalitions. And you really have to look at it from each member state to another member state and then find it. So There is no answer for that. I think it depends on the cost and benefit calculations at each and every country and each and every government party. And
Yeah.
then we'll see. The key element which moves all that is public pressure and the narrative, the shift in the narrative. And you look across Europe, any public poll you do right now,
Yeah.
the support for Israel is down to a level never seen.
Yeah.
Because every night we have a live stream genocide on our TV screens.
So moving back to those that are willing, or to some extent willing, I want to talk about the mechanisms that could be in play for them to affect change on this. And, what I see, the EU broadly having, and then what could be of these like coalitions of the willing, is two primary levers. I see first the economic relationship with Israel, because of course the EU as a whole is the largest trading partner of Israel and the largest, source of foreign direct investment. And so this would be able to place pressure behind the euro backing the war in some sense. And then there's the economic pressure on the United States that I think could be possible, that I don't see being talked about much. And this would be able to, because as well, of course, the EU is the largest trading partner as a bloc as well of the United States. And this could then pressure the core source of the war you're talking about, which is U.S. arms sales to Israel. And so how do you assess these two levers that there could be an effect unilaterally or a coalition basis of European states? And how do you think that plays into the current fear or hesitance that certain countries have right now to ruffle feathers with Trump?
Well, first of all, on the European leverage, individual countries don't have that much of a leverage, right? It's the commercial bloc of the EU. We represent 1/3 of the trade. By the way, we are not the first investor. I think others are there. I think the US might be even the first primary investor in Israel. But in terms of commercial interactions, we have a 70 billion annual trade, 42 billion of which is goods, and the remaining 28 is in services. And so that's true. We are very important, but we only have impact if we had made full use of that leverage, meaning the entire bloc. And this is commercial policy, which, as you know, is a community competence. And there we have to move through qualified majority, and even to suspend the entire trade with them, that would be the sort of the nuclear bomb. We need an unilateral. We need unanimity to decide this. Even for deciding on banning trade with settlements, there's a legal argument. Some would say it falls under commercial policy, but it's outside the association agreement. Others would say they are important foreign policy considerations, which might require unanimity vote. Either way, you would need to have, if not qualified majority, all 27 supporting this. Meaning that our leverage is only really significant and probably and game-changing if we work as a collective force. If we work individually, these are important measures. They create momentum. They allow certain member states to work in coalitions of the willing outside the EU orbit, as you would see the recognition of the state of Palestine, which goes with Canada, Australia, and others, but it doesn't have the same leverage. Arms embargo is something else, because the arms embargo can be decided upon both at EU level, but since Germany is the most important supplier after the US, representing about 30% of all arms supplies, the fact that Germany already did that is an important signal. Yet it is a half-baked thing, because it doesn't affect any of the ongoing contracts. They are very important ongoing contracts, and it only limits itself to what things which can be used in Gaza, or what is being used in the West Bank. I mean, so it's a little bit vague, but it's an important measure taken already, right? I mean, Italy had 3 or 4% of the overall arms supply. Of course, that would add something. But I mean, actually, the German component is the most important one when it comes to European arms supply. Now, the key thing is, of course, the US, right? And so just to sum up, on the EU front, we only make really impact if we work as a collective force. But it's very important what member states are doing, because it, and you can actually, isolate Israel further. I mean, especially, ministers like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, or violent settlers, and etc. And you can, for instance, arrest Mr. Netanyahu if he were to come again on, or you could, for instance, stop all calls of, all calls of ships to any European court. This is a national decision. You could prevent Mr. Netanyahu to fly via European airspace, right? I mean, there are so many things individual countries can do on the consular services, on universal jurisdictions of indicted or suspected war criminals, where you don't need the EU at large. But when it comes to the trade leverage points, it's the EU which makes a difference. now comes Trump. I think it's correct to say that the specter of Mr. Trump and his unreliable, erratic, unpredictable, and at times vengeful behavior is a deterrent to some European leaders to move forward. And you have seen already, I mean, how problematic it is when it came to NATO and the response towards the Russian aggression, where actually Trump has shied away from taking a tough and clear stance against Mr. Putin. I mean, now he seems to be a little bit annoyed by him. But hey, you may be away just one phone call between Putin and Trump, and things might change, right? And the same with yesterday's much heralded meeting between Trump and the leaders of some Arab countries and Turkey, or Turkey, as we call them now. And we don't know whether this meeting on Monday between Trump and Netanyahu will change anything. Certainly, Netanyahu will not be very happy with the proposals he listened to through third parties now. So we don't know. Trump is very difficult to read. And, that's one of the reasons why European leaders are very hesitant to confront him on another point where, and allow me to correct you on one point, is it's not just AIPAC, right? Because AIPAC supports both Democrats and Republicans. I mean, they play their chips on both sides of the aisle. It's also the 90 million evangelicals, and without their support, he would not be reelected. Many of whom are single-issue voters, abortion, for instance, but also the Israeli point is a very important consideration for them. And he knows this, and he said this publicly. You can't succeed as a politician in the US. He's on record without having the support, without being seen as anti-Israeli or be not pro-Israeli. Very much the electoral considerations. We have midterm elections in just over a year. That's a real test for him. And that we'll see whether he becomes a lame duck president in the second half of his presidency, or someone who can continue, right?
Yeah.
Well, so I'd say that that explains sort of the reluctance of European leaders to confront him, because there's the NATO thing, there's the Russia thing, there is the trade war thing, so to speak. I mean, the fact that Europeans accepted nolens volens, nilly-willy, this completely unfair deal with him, where we accept that on our cars 15% of taxes and duties are imposed while we, have nothing on the side is just pathetic, right? And in the European Parliament, hotly debated as such. But I understand European leaders will say better to have a predictable bad deal than no deal at all with an erratic, unreliable, and vengeful president.
Yeah, I mean, I come from the perspective right now that it is a really opportune time to place pressure on Trump in all regards, actually, from the European side, because while everything you say is true, I'd say it's interesting right now looking at the domestic politics of the United States that the assassination of Charlie Kirk has been a unifier for the right. But I would say before that, there actually was more plurality in opinions from like this evangelical base you talk about on many issues, but definitely on Israel as well. And so I felt that Trump saw that while his, bureaucratic concentration of power is moving in the direction he would like, his actual support from the base is a little bit more wavering than he would like. And now that's shifted a bit. But I do think today's better than tomorrow, basically, is what I would say, that it's only going to get harder and harder for Europe to kind of put pressure. So that's my little pushback on that to some extent. But of course, I understand it is easier to navigate something than enter the instability of full confrontation or any confrontation with Trump.
Well, honestly, I second you on that one. I try to explain the hesitancy of European leaders. You can see we had, by the way, if you look at Sanchez or the Irish leaders or the Slovenian or the Belgium, who decided to move forward, they say, well, sorry, we have a point of contention here and we stand up to it, right? What I was trying to explain that why countries like Germany, Italy, they weigh not only the historical obligations towards Israel, but also the geopolitical considerations in particular. And so does Mr. Macron. Mr. Macron as well. He's playing both sides, right? He's playing for domestic policy reasons, where he's deeply unpopular and where his new prime minister has to find a coalition majority, which is something which is not easy in the shark pond of French politics, but also where he also has to, be understanding towards Mr. Trump. And then there is the Ukraine as well. People are very, especially on the Eastern European front. I mean, they don't want to confront Trump because they depend
Yeah.
on the continuation of the nuclear shield and the protection through NATO, which depends to a large extent on American presence and commitment. So you don't want to rock the boat. But I agree with you. In my understanding of how Mr. Trump operates, he respects strength and he has contempt for differential, for weak, and sort of treatment of which he revels in being flattered, right?
Mm.
On the other hand, he only respects strength. And if you look at the countries who actually project strength, well, you see he accept that. Turkey severed ties with Israel, not a reaction from Washington.
Yeah.
Russia says, sorry, Mr. President, this is my turf, and I decide on how I'm going to run my turf. China said, hey, let's go all the way, right? You want to impose tariffs on us? Be my guest.
Yeah.
How about rare earth, right? And then, wow, immediately he jumped down. He climbed down the tree much, much faster than you could imagine. So all these bombastic speeches about, when finished the war of Russia within one day upon taking up office, etc., etc. Nothing of that when he is being confronted by a really strong player who calls the bluff, basically. Now, when the EU, and that's the problem with the EU, we have 27 member states, diverging interests, Chancellor Merkel, the problem of needing to fund the largest debt package any German government has basically accepted in German history, right? So meaning, and you can only finance that if you have strong economic growth. So he says, I need a deal. I need predictability. My companies need predictability. And I accept the 15% penalties from Trump. At least they know what they're dealing with, right?
Yeah.
So they want to deal with 50%. But again, I think they make the mistake in thinking that Trump will actually stop right there.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle.
No, it is, because now the Commission just decided to impose penalties on huge tech companies in the US. Wow. You think, are you surprised that Mr. Trump is saying, well, that's nice, I will accept that? No, he will not, right? Where does he stop?
Yeah.
You have to, I think, be tough on that one. I think that's my understanding. And if the way I read players across the globe to stand up, Brazil, take South Africa. Brazil doesn't bend over. South Africa doesn't bend over. Colombia, part of the Western Hemisphere, they don't bend over, and they don't have the firepower of the EU. So for me, and that's the reason why in my article I said it's a matter of principle as well, because you don't stand up for your principles, for your interests and your principles. You not only lose the trust of your international partners and notably of the Global South, more importantly, you lose the trust of your citizens. And that is kiss of death in a democracy where people want to be reelected. Now, so, I think you remember, Samuel, when the US under George W. Bush invaded Iraq, right?
Yeah.
They also had a coalition of the willing where a couple of European partners, including the UK and the Poles, were there.
Yeah.
Do you remember who actually stood up? Was President Chirac and Chancellor Schröder. And they went big in terms of polls on the home front for that. I said, no, we are going to be bullied by this president, of the US who thinks he can dictate the terms. And I think that's exactly what European leaders should do right now. Because if you look at the polls, the European polls regarding Trump, large swaths of the European public, and not among the younger parts, are very much critical of Trump. I think the only country, I may be wrong, only country where are more likes than dislikes of Trump is Romania. Romania, the country with the former President Ceausescu.
Yeah.
So I don't want to extrapolate too much on that one. But I mean, you could see a very critical view of Mr. Trump because of his persona, because of his policies across Europe.
Yeah, and that was exactly where I wanted to close, is this credibility question. And so you see it that there needs to be a, European response to Iraq right now in order to have the credibility not only with its allies, but with its adversaries.
Yes, I think so. And also what I don't fail to understand, the US is not just a monolithic political bloc. Yes, there is Mr. Trump. He has a completely outsized role over the Republican Party. But there is a Democratic Party which had nearly 50% of the vote. There are midterm elections in over a year, right? I mean, if if Europeans were to play hardball, then Trump could not afford to lose the European market because this would have immediate costs for the American consumer. So it's just a matter of how much hardball you want to play. We were, when Russia invaded in February 2022, Ukraine, the Germans were the first and followed by many others. And the Commission was in the lead under President von der Leyen to say, we have to play tough and we have to accept that we are going to suffer a bit because of the sanctions, because we actually had a great life depending on cheap energy imports from Russia and very much cheap electronic products and other sort of natural nature resources from China. We need to decouple. And this decoupling from Russia was painful. In economic terms, it was very painful. However, we took this decision because we felt there was an overriding political and security objective. So what is wrong with actually pursuing this, exactly the same argument, the same route? I'm not talking about in this case, of the war on Gaza. I'm talking about the transatlantic relationship with Trump and how we can bring to the fore and to our relationship with Trump the strength we have as the largest trading bloc in the world, a normative setting power, where two permanent members of the Security Council, both nuclear powers, sit, and where we are as much important for the U.S. at large as the U.S. is important for us, and where we don't play sufficiently well, very, how shall I say, fragmented U.S. body politic and what is happening there, including among many, many, many consumers and investors who depend on the very flourishing relationship with the most important trade partner the U.S. has, which is Europe.
Well, I appreciate you saying this, and I could not agree more. So thank you so much for being on, Sven. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Sam, and good luck with your podcast. Bye.
Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you for listening to the Neomedieval Ledger. If you enjoyed this episode, then please like, subscribe, share to those in your community. If you have ideas or notes on what you would like to see covered in this podcast, please reach out to me. My email is analysis@samuel-dempsey.com. I look forward to seeing you next week for our next episode.